I always thought rock bottom would feel colder. But inside the hospital, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady beeping of machines, all I felt was heat. A suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I clutched Owen's small hand as he lay curled up in the hospital bed, his tiny frame swallowed by the crisp white sheets. His face was pale, his breath shallow. Every time his eyelids fluttered, I held my own breath, afraid he might not open them again. The doctor's voice was clinical, detached, like he had delivered this kind of news too many times to care. Your son needs immediate surgery. Without it, the damage could be irreversible. Immediate. That word echoed in my head. Immediate. Like I had thousands of dollars waiting to be spent. Like I hadn't already sold everything I owned. Like I hadn't already pleaded with charities, filled out forms, only to be met with a chorus of, "We're sorry, but there's nothing we can do." I pressed my knuckles against my lips, forcing back the sob rising in my throat. I can't lose him. How much? I asked, though I already knew the answer would break me. The doctor hesitated, then said the number. It might as well have been $1,000,000. It was impossible. I nodded, pretending I had options. Thank you, doctor. As he walked away, I turned back to Owen. His eyelids fluttered open, and when he saw me, he gave me a sleepy, weak smile. Mommy? His voice was hoarse. Are we going home? I swallowed hard. Soon, sweetheart. He nodded, content with my lie, and drifted back into a restless sleep. I stood there, staring at him, my hands trembling. I had nothing left to sell, no family to call. I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. And then, Miss Evans? I turned at the deep, steady voice. A man stood at the edge of the hallway, completely out of place in this world of plastic chairs and buzzing machines. His dark gray suit was crisp, his posture effortlessly confident. He had the kind of presence that drew attention without trying. Broad shoulders, sharp features, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to know too much. Everything about him was polished, calculated. But when our eyes met, something in his expression softened. Like he knew me. Like he had been waiting. I can help you, he said. I let out a bitter laugh. Help? The word felt foreign, like something that belonged to other people, not to a woman who had scraped and clawed through life, only to end up here, begging for something the world refused to give. I don't know who you are, I said, my voice hollow. And I don't take charity. His lips curved, not quite a smile, more like a challenge. I'm not offering charity. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. Then what are you offering? There was a pause, a beat of silence that stretched too long, and then he said it. Marry me. The words barely registered. I blinked, sure I had misheard him. What? I want you to marry me, he repeated, his tone calm. And in exchange, I'll pay for your son's surgery. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the cruel joke to land, but his face remained unreadable, his gaze steady. This was real. A strange man had just asked me to marry him. My stomach tightened. Every survival instinct screamed run. Who was he? Why me? What kind of man offers something so extreme? I should have walked away. I should have told him he was insane. But Owen was in that hospital bed, his tiny body fighting a battle I couldn't win for him. And I had nothing left. So instead I whispered, why? His eyes darkened. Because I've been looking for you, Claire, for a long time. My breath hitched. Looking for me? What the hell did that mean? But none of it mattered. Because when you're drowning, you don't question the hand that pulls you from the water. You just hold on. And so with my heart pounding in my ears, I nodded. I'll do it. I had never been inside a law office before. The walls were lined with dark mahogany shelves, filled with books I would never read, cases I would never understand. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive ink. Everything about this place screamed power. And money. I sat at the long glass table, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. Daniel Westwood sat across from me, perfectly composed, his suit unwrinkled, his expression unreadable. Between us lay a crisp stack of papers, the contract that would change everything. A 1-year marriage, 1 year of being his wife, of carrying his name, of stepping into a life so far removed from my own it might as well have been another universe. And in return, Owen's surgery, his future, his life. I should have been afraid. Maybe I was, but fear is different when you don't have a choice. I picked up the pen. My fingers trembled, but I steadied them. If I was going to do this, I wouldn't let him see me break. Are you sure? Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. I looked up. His blue eyes studied me, intense but unreadable. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. There was a pause. Then nothing. Nothing. Owen would get sicker. The hospital bills would pile higher, and I would still be stuck in that tiny, suffocating apartment, watching the world take everything from me, one piece at a time. I met his gaze. "Then I don't have a choice, do I?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You do, maybe, but not really." I exhaled, pressing the pen to the paper, and signed my name. Claire Westwood. It didn't feel real. I didn't look up, but I heard the rustle of paper as he signed his name beside mine. And just like that, it was done. The courthouse wedding. The ceremony was exactly what I expected. Cold, efficient, nothing more than signatures and an exchange of words in front of a judge. I stood in a borrowed dress, plain white, and a little too tight around the waist. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like he belonged in a wedding magazine. Sharp black suit, pressed white shirt, perfectly styled hair. He didn't look like a man getting married to a stranger. He looked like a man closing a deal. The judge asked us the questions, and we answered, yes. Yes. 2 words, and I became Claire Westwood. There was no kiss, no vows spoken in love. Just a handshake from the judge, a signed marriage license, and a band of gold slipped onto my finger by hands that were warmer than I expected. And then it was over. Daniel turned to me as we stepped outside the courthouse, his voice softer than before. "Owen's surgery is scheduled for next week. Everything is taken care of." I swallowed hard. It's real. This wasn't just a deal anymore. It was my life. The Penuels' car pulled up in front of a high-rise building that glowed against the night sky. I stared up at it, my breath catching. I had seen places like this in movies, in magazines, the kind of buildings that rich, untouchable people lived in. I was not one of those people. The lobby alone could have fit my entire apartment 3 times over. Gold accents, sleek black marble floors, a chandelier that looked like it cost more than my entire existence. I followed Daniel into the private elevator, my heart pounding as the numbers climbed higher. When the doors opened, I stepped into the penthouse and my throat went dry. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, stretching out in a sea of glittering lights. Everything inside was sleek and modern. Deep leather sofas, polished surfaces, artwork that probably belonged in a museum. It was beautiful. And it was not mine. I took a step forward, my shoes sinking into the plush carpet. The air smelled expensive. Even the silence here felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it belonged to someone else. Daniel set his keys down and turned to face me. "This is your home now," he said simply. I forced a breath. "It doesn't feel like home." He watched me for a long moment before nodding. "Then we'll make it one." His voice was steady, certain. And for the first time since signing that contract, I wondered, what does he really want from me? The words haunted me. I finally found her. They played over and over in my head, like a melody stuck on repeat, each time chipping away at the fragile sense of security I had built in this new life. Daniel had been looking for me, not for a wife, not for a contract, for me. But why? The question gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night, making me watch him closer. The way he studied me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his fingers hesitated over the stem of his wineglass when I spoke, the way he always knew what I needed before I even said it. This wasn't just business to him. I had to know the truth. I started small. A search on his name led to the expected results. Business magazines, financial reports, news articles about the self-made billionaire. Daniel Westwood wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful. But his personal life? Practically non-existent. No relationships, no scandals, no past marriages. And yet, he had been searching for me. I dug deeper, scrolling through interviews, press conferences, and then, in an old finance article, I found something. A passing mention of a health scare nearly a decade ago. Daniel Westwood, before his empire, before his billions, had collapsed from exhaustion in a small-town diner. My breath caught. No, it couldn't be. I clicked the link, my hands trembling. The details were vague, just a few lines about how he had suffered from extreme stress and malnutrition while trying to launch his first company. How he had been found unconscious in a diner. A diner. A small-town diner. My diner. Memories crashed over me. A rainy night, the diner nearly empty, the scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. A man slumped over in a booth, barely conscious, his skin clammy, his breath ragged. I had thought he was just another overworked dreamer, someone running on fumes and bad decisions. I had brought him water, made him eat a bowl of soup even though he insisted he was fine. I had stayed with him until he could stand again, and then he had disappeared. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Daniel Westwood wasn't a stranger. I had saved him once, and now, years later, he had come back to save me. I found him in his study that night, standing by the window, his silhouette outlined against the city lights. "You were looking for me," I said. Daniel turned, his expression unreadable. I took a step closer, gripping the edge of the desk. "You knew who I was before we met at the hospital, didn't you?" A long pause, and then, softly, "Yes." The word sent a shiver down my spine. I exhaled shakily. "Why?" He studied me, something flickering behind his blue eyes. "Because you saved my life, Claire." My breath caught. His voice was steady, but there was something raw in it. That night in the diner, I wasn't just exhausted. I was at my breaking point. Everything was falling apart. I had no investors, no future. And then you. He stopped, shaking his head slightly, as if the memory was still too much. "You didn't just give me food. You looked at me like I mattered." I swallowed against the lump in my throat. "I offered marriage because you knew I wouldn't accept charity?" "Yes." He didn't hesitate. The weight of it all crashed over me. He had rewritten the script of my life, turned me from a struggling single mother into his wife, and all because of a single night, years ago, when I had been kind to a stranger. My voice trembled. "This marriage was never just about Owen, was it?" "No." His eyes burned into mine. "It was about you." Silence stretched between us, thick and unspoken. I had spent so long believing no one had ever chosen me. And now, here was a man who had spent years searching just to find me again. I should have been afraid. I should have felt trapped. But instead, for the first time since signing that contract, I wasn't sure if I wanted to run. The penthouse didn't feel like home. It felt like stepping onto a movie set, one where I didn't belong. Everything was too big, too polished, too perfect. The kitchen gleamed with state-of-the-art appliances I didn't know how to use. The closets were filled with designer dresses with price tags I didn't dare touch. Even the air smelled expensive, like fresh linen and something rich and masculine that lingered long after Daniel left the room. I was supposed to be grateful, but instead, I felt lost. The first morning, I woke up to a knock at my bedroom door. A maid, an actual maid, stood there holding out a tray of breakfast that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel. Croissants, fresh fruit, eggs cooked perfectly, even a tiny glass of orange juice that I somehow knew was imported from somewhere unnecessary. I can get my own breakfast," I said, pushing the sheets off me. The maid smiled politely. "Mr. The Westwood insists, ma'am." Of course he did. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the tray, my stomach twisting. My body ached for food, but the sight of it made something bitter rise in my throat. For years I had eaten whatever I could afford. Leftover diner meals, canned soup, bread that was sometimes stale. There had been nights I had gone without, just so Owen wouldn't have to. And now? Now I had people waiting on me. It felt wrong. It felt temporary. I forced myself to take a bite. The food melted in my mouth, buttery and rich, and somehow that only made it worse. That night, Daniel found me in the dining room, staring at a plate of food I couldn't bring myself to touch. "Something wrong?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. I glanced at him. He had changed from his suit into something more casual, a dark sweater, tailored slacks. But he still had that air of control, of effortless power. I gripped my fork tighter. "I'm not used to this." His head tilted. "This? All of it." I gestured around me. The food, the clothes, the luxury. His blue eyes studied me for a long moment. Then, in that calm, measured voice of his, he said, "You're my wife now, Claire. This is your life." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "A contract doesn't make me your wife." Something flickered across his face, something unreadable. Before he could respond, a small voice interrupted us. "Mommy, look!" Owen came bounding into the room, his tiny feet skidding across the marble floor. He was clutching a toy car, a brand-new, expensive toy car. Daniel followed behind him, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Owen," I said slowly, "where did you get that?" "Daniel got it for me." My son beamed up at him, his eyes shining. "He said I can have any toys I want." I stiffened, my gaze snapping to Daniel's. He met my glare evenly. It's just a toy, Claire. That's not the point. His jaw tightened. Then what is? I hesitated. The point was, I wasn't used to this. I wasn't used to kindness without expectation. And Daniel Westwood was still a mystery I didn't know how to solve. Owen, oblivious to the tension, hugged the car to his chest. I like Daniel, Mommy. He's nice. My heart clenched. I looked at Daniel again, expecting to see smugness, but there was none. Just quiet patience. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as simple as I thought. That night, as I walked past Daniel's office, I heard my name. I knew I shouldn't stop. I knew I shouldn't listen. But something about the way he said it made me freeze. I finally found her, Daniel was saying. His voice was lower than usual, almost relieved. A pause, then another voice, his assistant, I assumed. And she doesn't suspect anything? My breath caught. No, Daniel said. Not yet. Not yet. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell did that mean? I told myself it wasn't real. That this wasn't a love story, that what we had was borrowed time. But then the days turned into weeks, and Daniel became more. More than a man who had saved my son. More than a contract. More than just my husband on paper. Soft moments, real feelings. It was in the small things, the quiet moments I never expected. The way he'd reach for my hand absent-mindedly when we walked together. How he'd tuck a blanket around me when I fell asleep on the couch, staying up to watch over me. The nights we'd sit on the balcony, the city stretching out beneath us, and he'd tell me stories about his past, his struggles, his victories, the loneliness he never admitted to anyone else. Or how he looked at Owen, not like a child he was obligated to care for, but like someone he wanted to protect. It was impossible not to fall. One weekend, Daniel surprised us with a trip to the countryside. Owen ran through the fields, his laughter bright and free, while I stood on the porch watching him. Daniel came up beside me, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He's happy, he murmured. I glanced at him. Yeah, he is. We stood in comfortable silence, the sun dipping low in the sky, painting everything in gold. Then he turned to me, his gaze intense. Are you? The question knocked the air from my lungs. Was I? I should have said no. That I was still cautious, still guarding my heart. But when I looked at Daniel, the way he was looking at me, waiting, hoping, I couldn't lie. Yes, I whispered. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but before he could, Owen came running up, breathless and excited. Mommy, Daniel, look what I found. And just like that, the moment slipped away. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My heart was betraying me. I was falling in love with my husband. But the contract still loomed over me, a silent countdown. And I couldn't forget. Daniel had done this for me, for Owen, out of obligation, not love. I rolled over, clutching the sheets, because soon this would all be over, and I wasn't sure I'd survive losing him. I never thought I'd be here, standing in the middle of a quiet street just outside my old apartment, staring at the man who had changed everything. Daniel stood before me, his blue eyes searching mine, his hands clenched like he was holding back something too big to contain. He had just told me he loved me, and I had no idea what to do with that. I don't want a contract, he repeated, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I don't want an arrangement. I don't want temporary. I swallowed hard. What do you want? I whispered. He stepped closer, the night air wrapping around us, thick with something unspoken. You. His voice was raw. I want you, Claire. Forever. Then, before I could process what was happening, he did something I never expected. Daniel Westwood, billionaire CEO, the man who never lost control, never let himself be vulnerable, dropped to one knee. My breath hitched. He pulled a small, velvet box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a ring that sparkled like the stars above us. But I wasn't looking at the ring. I was looking at him. At the man who had once been a stranger, who had turned my world upside down, who had searched for me when I didn't even know I needed to be found. Claire Evans, he said softly, his voice filled with a kind of hope that made my heart ache. Will you marry me? For real this time? No contracts, no deadlines, just us. Tears blurred my vision. I had spent so long believing I was alone. That love was something that happened to other people. But this man had chosen me, and for the first time I let myself choose him too. I nodded, unable to form words past the lump in my throat. A soft laugh escaped him, almost like relief, and then I whispered the only word that mattered. Yes, the wedding. It wasn't grand. There were no flashing cameras, no high society guests, no lavish ballroom. Just us, me, Daniel, Owen, a few close friends, and love. So much love. I stood beneath a canopy of fairy lights, holding the hands of the man who had somehow become my best friend, my safe place, my home. Owen stood between us, holding the rings. He grinned up at Daniel like he had been waiting for this day all along. And as Daniel slid the ring onto my finger, I realized something. This wasn't just my happy ending. It was my beginning. I had married a stranger, and somewhere along the way, he had become my forever. The apartment was smaller than I remembered. The walls felt thinner, the air heavier. It smelled like old memories, of cheap coffee and long nights spent wondering how I was going to survive. Owen was asleep in the next room, curled up on the worn-out couch, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I should have felt safe here, but all I felt was empty. I had thought leaving would make it hurt less, that if I walked away first, it wouldn't feel like I was being left behind. I was wrong, and then a knock at the door. Not a hesitant one, a demand. I already knew who it was. I hesitated, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then, with shaking hands, I opened the door. Daniel stood there, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie loose, his hair a little disheveled, like he had driven through hell to get here. His eyes burned into me. "Why did you leave?" I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to build a wall between us. "You know why." His jaw tightened. "No, I don't." I let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Don't play games with me, Daniel. I heard you. I heard you talking about the divorce settlement." Something flickered in his expression, shock, disbelief. Then realization. He exhaled slowly, raking a hand through his hair. "Claire," his voice was different now, lower, raw. "You don't understand." "Don't I?" I snapped. "This was always temporary, wasn't it? You helped me because you felt obligated. You married me because you thought you owed me something. And now that debt is repaid, and you're ready to move on." Daniel stepped forward, closing the space between us, his gaze fierce. "That's not true." I took a shaky breath. "Then tell me what is." A long silence stretched between us, thick with something undeniable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I wasn't preparing a divorce." My heart stopped. "I was rewriting the contract," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine, "to remove the expiration date." I couldn't breathe. Daniel took another step, his presence overwhelming. "Because I didn't want you to leave. Because I don't want a contract anymore." I shook my head, my mind spinning. "Daniel, I love you, Claire." Everything inside me froze. His voice was steady, but his hands clenched at his sides like he was holding himself back. "I've loved you since the day you handed me that bowl of soup in a diner and told me to stop being so damn stubborn. I've loved you through every argument, every moment you fought me, every time you looked at me like I was something more than just a billionaire with a name." Tears burned my eyes. "You don't have to say this. I'm saying it because it's the truth." I swallowed hard, my defenses crumbling. Daniel exhaled, his voice softer now. "I married you to save you, Claire, but somewhere along the way, you saved me." The words shattered me. I had spent so long believing I was alone, that love was something that happened to other people, not to me. But Daniel had found me, he had chosen me. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized something terrifying. I had never stopped choosing him. I told myself I wouldn't let this change anything. Finding out Daniel had searched for me, that he had rewritten the course of my life because of one fleeting moment in a diner, should have made me angry, maybe even resentful. But instead, it left me shaken, because if I was honest, a part of me was touched. Daniel Westwood, the ruthless billionaire, the man who carried himself with cool confidence and effortless control, had once been broken, and I, without even knowing it, had been the one to piece him back together. Now I was starting to see him differently. The walls between us weren't gone, but they were thinner. We still had our battles. I still pushed against his need to control things, and he still frustrated me with his unreadable silences. But there were moments now. Soft moments, unexpected ones. The way his gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he always remembered how I took my tea, extra honey, no lemon. The way he bent down to tie Owen's shoelaces without hesitation, as if the act of caring for my son came naturally to him. And then there was the way my pulse skittered whenever he was too close. like that night. I had just put Owen to bed when I heard the door to the penthouse open. Daniel walked in, his suit rumpled, his tie undone, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. I didn't think. I just reacted. "You look like hell," I murmured, stepping forward before I could stop myself. His lips quirked. "Good to know." I crossed the space between us, ignoring the part of me that warned I was getting too comfortable, too close. "Sit," I said, pointing at the couch. He hesitated, as if debating whether to argue, then exhaled and sank down. Without thinking, I reached for his tie, loosening it further, sliding it off. His breath hitched, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. But I felt it. The air shifted. I pressed my palm against his forehead. "You're burning up." "Long day," he admitted, his voice lower now. I hesitated, then walked to the kitchen, grabbed a cool cloth, and returned to press it against the back of his neck. My fingers brushed his skin, and he went still. I should have pulled away, but I didn't, because for the first time, Daniel Westwood wasn't untouchable. He wasn't the man in a crisp suit with perfect composure. He was just a man, exhausted, human, vulnerable. His hand lifted, slowly, hesitantly, and curled around my wrist. Our eyes met. The moment stretched, pulled tight, charged with something neither of us were ready to name. For a second, I thought he might kiss me. For a second, I wanted him to, but then he exhaled, closing his eyes, and the moment slipped through our fingers. I let my hand fall away. "I should go," I whispered, and I did. But my heart was still racing when I crawled into bed that night, because I knew everything between us had changed. It happened by accident. I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't trying to dig into things I had no business knowing. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. One moment, I was heading toward Daniel's study to ask if he wanted dinner. The next, I was standing just outside the slightly open door, his voice filtering through the crack like a slow-moving dagger to my heart. "Are you sure about this?" The voice belonged to Daniel's lawyer. Daniel sighed, the sound heavy. "Yes, it's time to move forward." My stomach twisted. "Move forward?" The lawyer hesitated. "I'll have the divorce settlement finalized then." Divorce. I barely heard the rest of the conversation. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. I had been right all along. This was always temporary, a contract, a favor to a woman he once owed something. Not love, never love. I stumbled back before I could hear anything else, before I let myself break right there in the hallway. I had been foolish to believe this could be anything more, that we could be anything more. I packed in a daze, clothes shoved into bags, essentials stuffed into Owen's backpack. I moved like I was outside of my own body, like I was watching someone else make the worst decision of her life. Because what choice did I have? I couldn't stay and wait for Daniel to hand me divorce papers, to look at me with pity instead of love. I wouldn't let him take my dignity, too. I turned to Owen, my voice barely holding steady. "Sweetheart, we're leaving." He blinked up at me. "Where?" "Somewhere new, but I like it here." His small fingers clutched his favorite toy car, the one Daniel had given him. "Daniel will be sad." I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "No, baby, he'll be fine." Owen's lip wobbled. "Will we see him again?" I should have lied. Should have told him something to ease the ache in my chest. But I couldn't. So instead I whispered, "No, we won't." And then I grabbed our bags and walked out the door before I could change my mind. I told myself that night didn't mean anything. That touching Daniel like that, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips, hearing his breath hitch in the silence, it was nothing. Just a moment, but moments had weight. And after that night, they started piling up. I hadn't wanted to go. Daniel insisted. "You're my wife," he reminded me as he adjusted his cufflinks. "People expect to see you." That word, wife, still didn't sit right. It didn't feel real. But when I stepped into the ballroom that night, wearing a navy gown that clung to me in all the right places, with Daniel's hand resting lightly against the small of my back, I understood why he had brought me. Because to the world, we looked real. Elegant chandeliers hung overhead, casting golden light across the sea of glittering dresses and tailored tuxedos. Waiters glided through the crowd with crystal glasses of champagne, and somewhere in the distance, a live quartet played something soft and classical. It should have been breathtaking. Instead, I felt watched. And then I heard them. A group of women, their voices low, hushed, filled with that kind of curiosity. "Did you hear? She was a waitress before all this. She trapped him with that sick kid, I stiffened. Before I could turn, Daniel's voice cut through the air like a blade. Is that so? The women froze. Daniel's arm curled around my waist, not possessively, but protectively. His expression was calm, but his voice was ice. Interesting, he continued, his blue eyes flicking over them with quiet disdain. Considering my wife is the only woman in this room who knows what it means to earn something on her own. Silence. Then he turned to me, his gaze softening, as if I was the only person that mattered. You ready to go? I swallowed, my chest tight. I nodded. We left, but I didn't forget. I was still reeling when we got back to the penthouse. I turned to Daniel the second we stepped inside. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said simply. I did. I exhaled shakily, hugging my arms to my chest. People will always talk. He took a step closer. Let them. My pulse skittered. The air between us was heavy, thick with something that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had. Maybe I had just been too afraid to name it. I lifted my chin, trying to ignore the way his gaze lingered on my lips. Why do you care what they say about me? Daniel's eyes darkened, because I remember the girl who saved my life. Something inside me cracked. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me. But suddenly he was there, inches away. His hand lifted, his knuckles brushing the side of my jaw, a touch so light it sent a shiver down my spine. And then his lips met mine. Soft, slow, but undeniable. The kind of kiss that made the world tilt. The kind of kiss that stole breath and shattered walls. I should have pulled away. I didn't, because for the first time since this arrangement began, I didn't want to pretend.